As the temps start rising and you feel that familiar urge to refresh your closet, don't waste your money on pieces that you'll only wear once and for just one season. Quince changes that. Their clothes are timeless, lightweight, and far more elevated than anything else at this price. Your wardrobe can finally match your standards. My next trip is a travel conference, and I'm bringing my Comfort Stretch Traveler 5-pocket pants, classier than jeans, but just as comfortable. You can get 100% linen shirts and dresses from $30, Lux swimwear, Italian leather platform sandals, and much more. The best part, everything with Quince is half the cost of similar brands. By working directly with top artisans and cutting out the middlemen, Quince gives you luxury without the markup. And Quince only works with factories that use safe, ethical, and responsible manufacturing practices and premium fabrics and finishes. Give your summer closet an upgrade with Quince. Go to quince.com/traveler for free shipping on your order and 365-day returns. That's QUINCE.com/traveler to get free shipping and 365-day returns. Quince.com/traveler. And thanks to Quince for sponsoring this episode of Amateur Traveler.
The last thing you want to hear when you need your auto insurance most is a robot with countless irrelevant menu options. Which is why with USAA Auto Insurance, you'll get great service that is easy and reliable, all at the touch of a button. Get a quote today. Restrictions apply.
USAA.
Amateur Traveler, episode 950. Today, Amateur Traveler talks about rapids and cliffs, ancient people and intrepid explorers, swampers, sand, and schist, as we go rafting down the Grand Canyon. This is Chris Christensen from Amateur Traveler. Let's talk about the Grand Canyon. This is going to be another solo show, except not, because I did not raft down the Grand Canyon by myself, and I'll be joined by some of the people who were with me in various different sound clips as we go through the episode. But I was invited on a trip with Western River Expeditions to do a 7-day trip down the Grand Canyon, and the only appropriate response to that is yes, please, sir. This was a sponsored trip, which means they paid for the trip. I paid for the flights to Las Vegas, a hotel night, and all of the tips, but everything else was covered by Western River Expeditions. And I'm very pleased because this was a bucket list trip. This is something that I've been wanting to do well before we ever did any episodes on the Grand Canyon. We have at least 2 episodes on rafting the Grand Canyon. I love both of them. This is going to be a little different because it was a very personal experience. There are 2 starting points for this trip if you take this Western River 7-day Grand Canyon trip. You can either start in Las Vegas or you can start in Page, Arizona. Most of our group actually started in Page, but about 8 of us flew in to Las Vegas because it's easy to get flights there, spent the night at the Marriott Las Vegas, got up to meet at 4:45 in the morning, had a quick sack breakfast there at the hotel before taking a bus down to Boulder City, which is near Hoover Dam, where we got on a Grand Canyon Airlines small plane to fly to Page to meet the rest of the group. I'm going to mention buses and planes and a helicopter in this particular episode. All of that is included in the price of the trip. The price of the trip is a little less than $5,000 per person. So there's quite a lot involved. And the logistics of this trip, I'll talk about a little bit later, are pretty amazing to think about. We flew into Page Airport, having flown north of the Grand Canyon with some spectacular scenery, but not quite seeing the Grand Canyon on our flight over. It's now about 7 o'clock in the morning, and we meet the rest of the group, get in a bus, stop at a convenience store for some last-minute beverages or snacks, and then head to the river at Lee's Ferry. All Grand Canyon rafting trips start from Lee's Ferry. It's one of the last places where you can drive to the river, is why the rafts will start there. This was also the only point across the river for quite a long time, from 1870s until 1928. This was it for hundreds of miles. Lee's Ferry is downriver from the Glen Canyon Dam. Obviously, you're not going to raft over the dam. You're not quite in the Grand Canyon there, but you're right at the beginning of Grand Canyon National Park. We pull up in our bus, and when we get out, everyone takes their soft-sided bag. You've got a duffel bag. This is not a wheelie suitcase kind of trip because all of your luggage has to be packed into dry bags. And we're issued a dry bag that already has a tarp in it and a water bottle, a sleeping bag and a sheet, and we put our duffel in there. And before we do, we take out a water bottle. Theirs or ours. This is a desert that you're going through, and they really wanted us to be drinking about a gallon of water a day. And that sounded like a ridiculous amount of water. I think there were days I drank 2 gallons of water. It is a dry area. Even though you're wet quite a lot as you're going through the rapids in the Grand Canyon, you have to stay hydrated. And then we pulled out everything else we were going to need during the day and put that in a smaller dry bag and lashed those to the top of the raft so that we could have access to them in our water bottle as we went down the river. I wasn't wearing a watch, but I'd say it's maybe 8 o'clock in the morning, and we're now on the river, on the Colorado River in Grand Canyon National Park. Let me tell you a little bit about the equipment that we're using here. Western River is doing this expedition on a motorized boat, a J-rig. And the reason why I did a motorized boat is you can do the whole main part of the canyon, 188 miles, in 7 days. And if you wanted to do that on a paddle boat, for instance, which is a much smaller boat, and obviously you don't have any motor assist, it's going to take about twice as long. So if you wanted to do a 7-day paddle boat trip, we talked to somebody who, as we were getting out, was also getting out at the same place as us. And they had actually hiked down to Phantom Ranch in the middle of Grand Canyon National Park to do an 8-day paddle trip. So they had done less rapids, a whole lot more hiking. And so the J-rig does make it a more convenient option if you want a trip that is only 7 days long instead of twice as long. We didn't do the entire canyon. The crew on our rafts then went on and did another 3 days with a different group that got on as we got off. And so the total, if you want to do all of the Grand Canyon, would be about 10 days. But the 7-day option was a pretty great option. Enough time on the river, chance to see everything. They also do a 6-day option, especially in the heat of the summer when you can't do as much of the hiking as we did. We did this in the first week of June, which is typically no rain and not quite as hot as it's going to be in the heat of July. I say typically because as we got on the boat, it was raining. Now, one of the things that we packed, and we'll talk more about packing later, is we were told to pack waterproof pants and a waterproof jacket, our weather suit. And they said, even though it is not likely to rain in June, you're going to want this because the water is cold on the river, and it also provides some sun protection, especially the pants. And we were glad we had them because we were in our rain gear right here, and it already had started to rain as we got on the river, although it didn't rain that much on that day. And the other reason you're going to want it is the water in the river is cold. Basically, the water comes out of the bottom of Glen Canyon Dam, and so it's in the low 50s, maybe 52 degrees or so. And each day you go down the river, it will heat up about 1 degree. And so it will get warmer as you get along, but it will never get warm. And so that first time we hit a rapid and we got wet, we were glad for whatever weather gear we were wearing.
Oh, bye. And that's just a 4.
So the J-rig is 37 feet long. This is a large contraption here, and it is made of 5 different inflatable pontoons lashed together and then with a metal frame on top. We talked about the different options in the last episode for rafting the Grand Canyon. I won't get into the other ones, but go back to that episode if you're interested in more different options. So in terms of where you're sitting on this long raft, the very first part of the raft is the pontoons, and 9 different people can ride on the pontoons. You don't ride on the outer 2 pontoons, you ride on the inner 3, and as many as 3 people in a row there. So you can have 9 there, and behind them can be 6 people sitting on top of some coolers. So you got a little more of a view here. You don't get quite as wet. You still get very wet as you do on the front of the raft. So if you're wanting the most adventure, you ride on the front, and when a wave comes, well, a call goes out.
Hi, my name is Allie. My favorite part of this trip has been all of the rapids as well. When it gets really crazy, they yell, "Suck rubber!" And you have to get down real low so you don't get thrown into the water, but it's been a blast.
So yeah, if you're riding on that front part, you are straddling the tube, and when the wave comes, you lean forward down against the raft so that a wave doesn't wash you off the rapid. You've got ropes in front of you and behind you. You've got one hand on the rope in front of you and your strong hand on the rope behind you so that you will stay on, but that raft is going to flex a fair amount. It comes up at, oh gosh, I don't know, 30-degree angle at least on some of those rapids. At least it felt like it. So behind that, as I say, is the coolers. I spent a lot of time sitting in the coolers so I could use my camera glasses to film some video as we went through the rapids.
Oh, that got me.
Yeah, that was good. You're at heel time. Yeah, good. You got it good. 25.
And then on the left and the right-hand side behind the coolers, you're facing more sideways. That's called the chicken coop. You stay a little drier in the chicken coop. It's a little more relaxed. You're leaning back against the gear or the big dry bags with all our stuff in it in the middle. And then there's the princess seat behind that, which is in front of the boat captain, which keeps you much more dry. That one is an easier ride, but also on a hot day, you get pretty hot there because you don't get as wet as much from the rapids. We had 2 rafts and 28 people, 14 people on a raft. They can hold more than that, but actually 14 was a pretty nice number. And we actually had one group from St. George, Utah that had 14 people, so they took one raft, and the rest of us, all strangers, took the other raft. All strangers at the start. One thing that I did not record, but from one of the people that we went with, is strangers at the start and family at the end, and I thought that was a good way of putting it. And then there's all sorts of gear strapped onto this raft because all of the food you're going to eat for the whole week, plus the food for the next group that is going to be the last 3 days of our trip. So 10 days worth of food is in storage compartments on the rapid, plus tents and cots and chairs and cooking equipment, ice and dry ice for the food, and 2 crew members. Without the passengers and their gear, the raft already weighs 12,000 pounds. And so the good news is these are very stable crafts. They flex a lot and they go through the rapids. But in the history of Western, they've seen 4 J-rigs flip over, which happens a lot more with a paddle boat. And 3 of those were in a particularly weird high water year in 1983, where they almost lost the Glen Canyon Dam. That's just a whole different story, but basically they realized that the spillways were eating out the base of the dam, and even though they had lots of record rain coming and the dam was full, they had to very quickly empty a lot of water out of Lake Powell, or they would have lost Glen Canyon Dam, which would be very, very bad. When we were running the river, the water coming out of that dam was about 14,000 cubic feet per second, which is a lot of water, but in 1983, it was more like 100,000 cubic feet per second, and so it was a very different experience in that year, and I'm glad I was not on the river in that year. But the dam does provide much more stable rafting throughout the year for the Grand Canyon. The first day is a fairly easy day of rafting, and that's probably just as well because you're just getting used to the whole thing. You cross under Navajo bridges, and these are bridges, the first one built in 1929 to replace Lee's Ferry, and that was the only bridge over the Grand Canyon for hundreds of miles until the building of Glen Canyon Dam. And then around 7 miles, and the mileage on Grand Canyon is all measured from Lee's Ferry, and you can get a great guide. There's a waterproof guide that I have, the Grand Canyon River Guide, and I'll put a link to that in the show notes. Although smarter was Joanna, who put hers in a waterproof bag because not only could she use it more often, but also when it fell into the river, we were able to go back around and find it because it floated. But right around, I started to say, mile 7, you enter in not Grand Canyon, but you entered into Marble Canyon. And we call this Marble Canyon because that is what John Wesley Powell called it. And we really can't do an episode of the Grand Canyon without giving a nod to John Wesley Powell, who was the first known person to run the rapids of the Grand Canyon. John Wesley Powell was a Civil War veteran. He lost his right arm in the Battle of Shiloh, and he was a geologist and naturalist, and he became fascinated by this whole Colorado River basin. And he convinced Congress to fund a survey of the region, promising to chart it, because this was kind of a hole in the maps at this point. So they launch in May of 1869, way up in the Green River, Wyoming, in 4 wooden boats. And by the time they get to this area, they've really lost a lot of their provisions already, and it's not the kind of trip that you would pay to do today. He had a crew of 10 men when he started. He did lose 3 along the way, but we'll talk about that later. And he names a lot of these different rapids or canyons. And so he's the one that decides that this is now Marble Canyon and that the Grand Canyon will start really 3 days into my trip. He writes a book about his trip, not during the trip. And some people think that he either made some things up or couldn't quite remember things correctly. And so some of the people who followed in his footsteps had some problems using Powell's guide as a guide through the rapid. So we passed through 6 Mile Riffle and then Badger Creek Rapid. And Badger Creek Rapid and the next big rapid, Soap Creek Rapid, were named by Jacob Hamblin. He's known as the Buckskin Apostle. He was a Mormon missionary and outdoorsman who traveled frequently in the region, and he shot a badger at Badger Creek, cooked it up at Soap Creek, and at Soap Creek there was alkali in the water, and so it caused a soap to form. So all of these rapids have names that are associated with someone who passed through here before you. Before I get lost in the minutia of the different rapids that we're doing, I want to just establish here that we're going through an amazing landscape.
Hi, my name's Andy Stridoff. I'm from St. Augustine, Florida. The highlight of my trip, this is the tough one. The whole trip has been a highlight. The other traveling guests with us have been great. Couldn't ask for a better group. After the rapids, which is, of course, what the Grand Canyon is known for, it's coming up with your own way to survive and just take in unbelievable surroundings. Words cannot describe what you're looking at every day and every minute. It's unbelievably beautiful, and it's memories for a lifetime. It's just a fantastic trip, and I'm so glad I took it.
Okay, Joanna Horton, Grand Canyon. It's been absolutely amazing. It's been quite a spiritual experience coming to the Grand Canyon and being immersed in the immense beauty. I believe it's God's creation, and He created all this through many different means, earthquakes and floods, and it's just been amazing being here to see the beauty of the Grand Canyon, and I recommend it to anyone.
The thing that very quickly occurred to me is that I don't know if I've done another trip where for 7 days there is always a view. There's a new view coming every minute as you're going around the river, and it's stunning, and each one would be worth taking a picture of. And you feel like you didn't take enough pictures to capture this trip when you come off it. At least I did. And Joanna's saying the beauty of the creation. I sort of feel like the creator, you're saying, well, that's an amazing view. And you go around the next corner and God's saying, hold my beer. You haven't seen anything yet. Back to the rapids. The next rapid you come to is a 5 to 6. And I should say that while rapids in the rest of the world are on a 1 to 5 scale, in the Grand Canyon, they're a 1 to 10 scale. And so a 6 in the Grand Canyon is a 3 elsewhere. And that rating is not how much fun you're going to have or how wet you're going to have, but how technically challenging it is for the boat captain. And so it's a little misleading because you might have a rapid that is a 10, but if the captain does it just right, it's fairly uneventful. But if the captain doesn't do it right, it can be quite eventful or even potentially catastrophic. And the next one is one of those catastrophic rapids, at least historically, and that's Brown's Riffle. And Frank M. Brown was the president of the Denver, Colorado Canyon and Pacific Railroad Company. And there was an expedition that went in 1889 to try and decide if they could put a railroad through the Grand Canyon, which at first I'd have to say sounded a little crazy to me as we're rafting this canyon. But there's some logic to it in the sense that if you think about it, if you're putting a railroad along a river, then the grade of the railroad is always going downhill and you don't have to worry about hills. So it actually was determined that it might be feasible, but not with Brown's expedition was disastrous. And in Brown's Riffle, it's named after him because that is where he drowned. And our guides did not think that that expedition was particularly well equipped, although really neither was Powell's. They didn't bring lifesavers. They didn't bring, and I mean the kind that can save your life, not the ones you put in your mouth. And they also were wearing really heavy clothing so that if you fell into the water, you very quickly could get sucked down and drown, as Brown and two other members of his party did. And just past the rapid, there is an inscription, a memorial inscription for F.M. Brown was drowned July 10, 1889, that we pulled over to take a look at. You got some other rapids there before we finished up the day. Sheer Wall Rapid, House Rapids. These are one's a 2 and a 3. The other one's a 7 to 8. And the rapids have a range because it can depend on the flow of the river at the time. And then we ended up camping at 18-mile ledges. So we've only gone 18 miles the first day. It's going to be uneven in terms of how many miles you do. The more rapids, the faster the river, the faster you go. So let's talk a little bit about camping. You pull off at camps and you don't have reserved camps, so it's first come, first served. And because of that, we tended to finish the day maybe about 2:30 or something like that, so that we could grab a campsite, because if you didn't grab one quickly enough, you might have to go quite far down the river, more than you were originally planning on doing.
You know what doesn't belong in your epic summer plans? Getting burned by your old wireless bill. While you're planning beach trips, barbecues, and 3-day weekends, your wireless bill should be the last thing holding you back. With plans that start at $15 a month, Mint Mobile gives you premium wireless service on the nation's largest 5G network. The coverage and speed, and sometimes the exact same towers that you're used to, but way less money. So while your friends are sweating over data overages and surprise charges, you'll be chilling, literally and financially. All plans come with high-speed data and unlimited talk and text. Use your own phone with any Mint Mobile plan and bring your phone number along with all your existing contacts. In my experience, switching was easy. This year, skip breaking a sweat and breaking the bank. Get your summer savings and shop premium wireless plans at mintmobile.com/traveler. That's mintmobile.com/traveler. Upfront payment of $45 for a 3-month 5-gigabyte plan required, equivalent to $15 a month. New customer offer for first 3 months only, then full price plan options available. Taxes and fees extra. See Mint Mobile for details. And thanks to Mint Mobile for sponsoring this episode of Amateur Traveler.
Whatever the occasion, effortless elegance is right this way. Because Hilton brings you new ways to stay courtesy of the Nomad London. And it doesn't stop at award-winning dining in a space draped in velvet and illuminated by vintage chandeliers. No, this day goes beyond with unparalleled personalized service and attentive hospitality. Oh, and did we mention the Nomad London can be booked using your Hilton Honors points at Hilton.com? Hilton, for this day.
And so we pulled over to Ledges. It is a sandy beach, as all of these campsites are, with some vegetation on it. All of these are along the shore, and they look fairly small. I'd say this was the smallest of all the campsites we had. It felt much more here like we were camping on top of each other. You get out of the raft with your dry bag, your life jacket, and you claim a spot. You come back and form a fire line when they call out for it, and get all of the bags off the raft, all of the chairs off the raft, all of the cots off the raft, and then also all the equipment they need for cooking dinner. And then while they're preparing dinner, you're setting up your tent if you want one, your cot, your chair, unpacking, possibly changing into dry clothes. Really depended. Some of us just lived in our swimsuits and our swim shirts all week. And then you're greeted with a really wonderful dinner at this point. I'm not going to say everything we ate at all the meals, but just to give you some example, this first night would have been steak, asparagus, grilled onions, very good dinner. And then the next morning was eggs, bacons, hash browns, and freshly baked muffins, even though we're here along the river. And a couple different rules for the camp that are going to prevent some of you from doing this trip. One is that you can't just go find a bush and pee behind a bush. All of that has to go in the river directly because these are very small campgrounds and there's not a lot of rain. And so otherwise, every campsite would be very smelly. And so you literally go pee in the river, which is an advantage for guys. And we had at least one of my campmates who had a solution for that.
My favorite part about this trip is what I call the Tinkerbell. And this is an instrument that gives us an even playing field with the men. Why? You can stand and use the restroom just off of the side of the bank. It is a game changer. I would highly recommend it if you go through the Grand Canyon.
And I'll put a link to that in the show notes. And then the other thing to know is that there is no running water at any of these places except for that river. And at this point in our trip, that river is relatively clear, but that will not stay the case. And we're drinking water that's been filtered out of the river. We're washing in the river. And then also all of your solid wastes from everything you eat from those wonderful dinners has to go back on the raft. So you're pooping in a box. There were two different toilets set up, one inside a tent and one further along a path that would be open air, and you would indicate that someone was there by a frisbee that was the hand washing station. So you take the frisbee to indicate that you were using that outdoor toilet, which mostly worked except for one or two times where someone missed a signal. So you're getting off the river something like 2:30. You're going to bed with the sun. So there's something like 8:30, 9 o'clock, maybe a little later for some. And so you have a fair amount of time at camp, and that for some was the favorite part.
Hi, my name is Mike, and my favorite part of the trip is just hanging out at the campsite with everyone.
Now, at this particular camp, most of us did not set up tents because it's June and it doesn't rain in June, right? That turned out to be not the case. That night it rained 6 different times, including a thunderstorm, and most of us did not go grab a tent because we were already wet by that time. So we just pulled that tarp out of our bag and pulled it up over us, making what they described as a green burrito. And so we were huddled under our tarps, which were very effective, I'd have to say, and trying to keep our gear dry. The bottom of my sleeping bag got soaked, but things dry out fairly quickly in the Grand Canyon. And it was a little bit of a surprising night. Day 2, we got up. It rained a little bit after we had our breakfast, after we'd all packed up. Got back on the rafts, did that reverse fire line to pack everything up, and headed back on the river. We made a stop for a hike. Again, on the 7th day, you have a little more time for that, and a scramble up a side canyon. Now, if you could picture the Grand Canyon, you get a lot of sheer cliffs, and then you get the softer rock, which has eroded, which is almost at a 45-degree angle. So this scramble was up one of those shorter segments to go to a viewing spot up at the top. And I found out fairly quickly that I was both the oldest person and probably in the worst shape of anybody on this trip, as I chose not to do the scramble up that last part of the rock. That morning we ran the 20-mile rapids, and that's a series of rapids that are in the 20 miles to 30 miles away from Lee's Ferry. We ran them in the rain with our rain gear on, and it was actually pretty cold. So we really got to see a variety of weather during this time. And just as we came out into the sun, because some of this depends on whether you're in the sun or in shade, and we were running a lot of these in shade just because of where the sun was and the direction of the river at this time. Just as we came out in the sun, we started to warm up. We went for lunch, and we had lunch in a cave, which was ironic because we were really looking forward to that cave right up until we got there, in which case we would have enjoyed the sun a little more to dry off. But that cave was interesting because we have been going through, at this point, a lot of the sandstone structures. There are 10 different levels of strata that you go through in the Grand Canyon. And at this point, we're getting deeper and deeper into the canyon, and the strata is going down and down, and the top levels are sandstone, but we get down to a limestone layer where the apex predator was mudworms. And in that cave, which is Redwall Cavern, John Wesley Powell thought that 50,000 people could fit in that cavern, but right at the mouth of the cavern, you could find these fossils for mudworms and also for trilobites, which is pretty cool. But you're way back in geologic time at this point. We shared the cavern for lunch with another group that had disabled veterans, including people in wheelchairs and people with artificial limbs, artificial legs, and I was impressed. In terms of wildlife, by this point, we've seen condors, we've seen a lot of smaller birds like swifts and swallows, we've seen bighorn sheep, lizards, and some other colorful migratory birds. Later on, we also saw a beaver, which surprised me a lot. After lunch, we didn't have any major rapids, although we had a number of smaller rapids. We also came to a place where they nearly built a dam. So Marble Canyon was nearly dammed off, but really this was the start of the success of the Sierra Club. And the Sierra Club was able to fight this. They did an ad campaign where they flooded the Sistine Chapel and said, if you flooded the Sistine Chapel, it'd be a whole lot easier to see the ceiling. And that helped kick off the popularity of the Sierra Club and defeat the dam. And now it is illegal for dams to be built in national parks. And we camped around mile 50 at Lower Dinosaur. We're not yet in officially the Grand Canyon, as Powell named it. Funny enough, that night everybody pitched tents, but we never again needed tents. It didn't rain for the rest of the trip. And the next day led to our most challenging hike, or at least the most challenging hike that I took part in, and one of the most spectacular, and that was up to Nankoweap granaries. And these are ancient Puebloan granaries. Here's Jeff, our tour leader, explaining it.
All right, what we're seeing here is remnants of the granaries from the ancestral Pueblo, also known as the Hisatsanom, the Moki, the Shinemu, or the Anasazi, the way that different tribes in the area describe them. Ancestral Pueblo is the preferred nomenclature today. These people lived between about 500 AD and 1250 AD was the heyday of their culture. They were a huge network of trading partners that stretched from the Grand Canyon to the west to the Rio Grande Valley in the east, all the way up to now Utah, Colorado by Mesa Verde, and up into where Canyonlands National Park is, all the way south down to where San Francisco Peaks are near Flagstaff. And these people had a culture that existed with different languages and different production systems that they would get together and trade things like cotton, corn, beans, squash, chert to make arrowheads and spear points. They had domesticated turkeys and dogs that they would use for pets and for food and for feathers. They would make cloaks out of turkey feathers woven into cotton fabric that would protect them from the rain and the elements. They had an amazing trade network that went all the way down to Mexico in the south, all the way out to the Pacific coast. We know this from records of macaw feathers that we find in some of the sites, seashells, and even cocoa remnants as far north as Chaco Canyon. Chaco Canyon was basically the political and economic center of their society, with the Great North, South, and East Road emanating from Chaco to different destinations along their trade route. These people lived a life of relative ease. They weren't scavenging, or just merely existing. They had plenty of food. Some say they had 2 or 3 years of food storage per household because they never knew what the weather was going to be like. It wasn't up until about 600 AD when they finally brought in beans into the corn, beans, and squash trifecta, which gave them a complete diet with all the amino acids and vitamins and minerals that they needed to subsist. They supplemented their diet with pinon nuts, with small game, large game. Around 1250 AD, they encountered a big drought cycle that lasted for many, many years, at which point farming became more difficult. They may have had political strife as well associated with that. And their society started to break up, and a lot of people abandoned their homes and pueblos and migrated to better spots for farming and for hunting. And today we know these people as the Hopi, the Zuni, and the Acoma Pueblos people. They all have similar building styles. They all had similar pottery styles that you can see throughout their culture. After their harvest, they would have so much that they couldn't eat it. They would need to store it for the next year or the next 2 years. And they would build granaries where they would put their excess crop inside these little compartments. They would light a fire, and then they would seal off the compartments, and the fire would eat up the oxygen inside of the compartment and vacuum pack their food for use in the future.
Which is all really cool and something I really wanted to see, but you had to hike up what they called the Stairmaster of Death. And it was a set of steps that went more or less straight up one of these inclines, and it kicked my butt. I was able to get to the top, but I had to take my own sweet time to do it. But from there, you get a view that is so pretty that if you find the National Park Quarter, the view on the National Park Quarter is from these granaries in the Grand Canyon. And it's also going to be the show notes of this episode, the main image. That was at mile 53. And finally, at mile 62, we get to the Little Colorado River coming into the Colorado River. And that marks the official beginning of the Grand Canyon. So we're leaving Marble Canyon, we come to Grand Canyon. There had been rain, as I mentioned, so there had been flash floods in the various side canyons that dump into the Grand Canyons. Turns out, by the way, that the way rapids are formed, if you look at rapids in the Grand Canyon, they're almost always by one of these side canyons that has brought in debris and rocks from flash flooding. So flash flooding has a very significant effect on the Grand Canyon. And because of the flash flooding, the Little Colorado, which is normally a beautiful blue color, was coffee brown mud. And we did hike up a ways so that some people in the group could swim some rapids in the Little Colorado River, but it was just almost pure mud. So most of us did not do it, but those who did were, I think, sneezing out mud for a couple days. We had lunch just down the way from there, about mile 63, and some people hiked up to see the remains of a TWA Super Constellation aircraft. So there was a significant air crash that happened here in the Grand Canyon in 1956 between a TWA plane and a United DC-7 plane, and it was such a significant loss of life that it actually led to the creation of the FAA, the Federal Aviation Administration, and rules around flying in general. I didn't mention how deep the canyon's been getting at this point. When we were at Lower Dinosaur the night before, the south rim was at 6,025 and the north rim at 9,200 feet, and we were way down at 2,800 feet, so fairly deep at this point. Another thing that almost changed the canyon is right at the beginning of the Grand Canyon there where the Little Colorado comes in, there were plans at one point to build a tramway so that you could get down to the river and have a restaurant down there and have people be able to hike down there coming down a tramway. But those plans were on Indian land, they were on Navajo land, and eventually the tribe did not approve it. Right around mile 63 and a half, you can see naturally occurring salt on the left side of the canyon. You're not allowed to touch it because these are sacred salt mines for the Hopi people who have a trail that leads up out of the canyon from there and occasionally come down and capture some of this salt for ceremonial purposes. And that night we camped at mile 65 at the Carbon Campground where Carbon Creek comes into the Colorado River. If you've ever been to the south rim of the Grand Canyon, at the eastern edge of the rim, you'll find the watchtower. And we camped that night in view of the watchtower. So we're just almost to the part of the canyon that I have seen from the top. When I look at my notes, I see that we as a group have started to bond. I start to figure out what other people are doing by this point. We have a teacher, we have a heart surgeon, we have an anesthesiologist, a luxury travel advisor, someone who's a general contractor, somebody else in IT, so I wasn't the only nerd, a real estate agent who's also a photographer, an environmental engineer, an interesting group of people. And getting to know that set of people was a highlight for me. And I didn't say this, but we had quite a few families. Of the people on the trip of 28 people, 10 of them were between the age of 16 and kind of late college age. Because going the first week in June, it was probably one of the first weeks that people could go. So we had a number of families on the trip who I think by this point were really enjoying their time together.
Hi, my name's Kerry Oman, and I'm from Springville, Utah. Last night I woke up about 2:15 in the morning, and I grabbed my camera and I set it up to take some pictures of the stars and the Milky Way. And as I was sitting there taking the pictures and looking out at this incredible location that we're sitting in and looking up at the stars and the Milky Ways overhead and shooting stars are going past me, I thought, the best part of this is that I'm with my daughter and with my son and with my family, and we were able to experience it all together.
And what's your website? As long as you're...
And I do have a photography website. It's carryomanphotography.com.
That night was much warmer. I didn't even get in my sleeping bag till about 2 a.m. till a cooler breeze blew down the Colorado. The next day was the day we were both looking forward to and dreading. So now we're currently at mile 65, but at the end of the next day, we're going to be at mile 108. So 3 days to get to 65 miles. And that fourth day, we're going to go a total of 43 miles. So this is going to be our biggest rapid day. Some of the biggest rapids we had were in this day, and we were looking forward to it and also just a little afraid, I think, at the same time. But it was also a day that the geology changes. We would get to both the widest and the narrowest part of the canyon over the next day. The first part is Furnace Flats, where the canyon really opens up quite wide because there's some very soft rock that has eroded away here to make the canyon quite wide. But then we would later on get to the gorge. The thing I did not know is that when you're at the rim of the Grand Canyon and you see all those layers, the very horizontal layers that are very typical for the Grand Canyon, you're not seeing some of the most interesting geology of the Grand Canyon, because as we started down the next day, suddenly we get this uplift and the layers on the canyon are now up at 30 degrees, 45 degrees, because an uplift has pushed up some much older rocks from the base of an old mountain into the canyon, and the canyon has cut through them. And so now you're entering the gorge. And the gorge is the most spectacular geology because suddenly you have this very black Vishnu schist, which is a metamorphic rock. Basically, this rock has been at the base of a mountain, was compressed. It is very black. It is very hard. And so it's harder for the river to cut through it. And so the channel gets narrower, and therefore you get more rapids here in the gorge. It's also just spectacular looking because into this rock, red granite, which is an igneous rock, came in as magma from lower down below, came up through the cracks in this black rock. And so you get this black rock with veins of red granite in it. It's quite spectacular. I've been to the North Rim, I've been to the South Rim, and I did not see it until I went down the river. And you enter the gorge twice on this trip, and then once if you do the 3-day trip after this. And we were in the upper Granite Gorge, and this is mile 77 through 118. So once we got there, we would stay in the gorge for the rest of the day.
My name is Dusty Anderson. I am from St. George, Utah. I'm here with my wife, where we are celebrating a week through the Grand Canyon. I grew up less than a couple hours from here, but had never been through the Grand Canyon, never river after the Grand Canyon, had only hiked occasionally near the Grand Canyon. And this has been an awesome experience because the guides have been amazing, telling us about the geology of the canyon, the different theories of how it was formed, and then looking at the different rocks and the different formations. And it's been very interesting to gain just a little bit of an understanding of the rocks and the geology in this area of the country. But beyond that, that's probably been my favorite part of the whole trip.
Now, I haven't mentioned the rest of our crew, but this seems like a good time to do it. Each boat has a boat captain and a swamper, and the swamper comes from back in the day where the person who was your crew person would help you bail out the craft. The swamper is doing whatever needs to be done, making sure that people don't fall off in rapids, making sure that they know what they're holding on to is correct, and also tying you up and untying you from the shore, and then helping with all the cooking and such, as are the boat captains. Our boat captain was Ronnie, and Ronnie has run the Grand Canyon about 200 times. And our swamper was Sarah. And Sarah, when she isn't doing this, is a geology major. So she loved telling us about the rocks. And Ronnie, when she isn't doing this in the wintertime, is a ski patrol. And Jeff, who is our tour leader, is the other boat captain, and Ronnie and Jeff are married. And the other swamper was Tommy. And when Tommy isn't doing this, he works for his brother in construction, and Jeff does ski lessons in the wintertime. The very first of the big rapids that day was Hance Rapid, just before you enter the gorge at mile 7.6. Quote unquote, Captain John Hance, who was one of the first settlers in the area, and quite apparently the storyteller, fighting in the Civil War originally as a Confederate and later for the Union, which is unusual. And then he mined minerals in the canyon, and notably asbestos and copper. Also built a hotel, and later on was hired by the Fred Harvey Company to live at Bright Angel Lodge and sit and tell stories, which is a pretty good job. I don't know if I could get that in my real retirement. And then from there, we came to Sockdolager. And if Sockdolager is not a name that trips off your tongue, it's because you did not live in the 1800s. That would be a big blow in a boxing match. A haymaker or a knockout blow would be a Sockdolager. And Powell named this Sockdolager because of the punch that it has. There are a few other big rapids and small rapids before you get to Phantom Creek and the Kaibab suspension bridge that crosses the river. So if you've ever hiked from rim to rim in the canyon, or you've hiked down to Phantom Ranch, then this is the place that you were at. And we were just passing it here on the fourth day of our trip, which is interesting how long we were into the trip before we got there. You also get to the Bright Angel suspension bridge. They're doing a lot of construction right now down there by Phantom Ranch. I'm not exactly sure what they're putting in, but you can see a lot of construction, helicopters and such. One thing I know that they're doing is replacing the pipeline that runs across the river under one of those bridges. There were so many rapids that day that they run together a little bit. Some of the bigger rapids were Horn Creek Rapid, which was an 8 to 9, Granite Rapid, which is another 8 to 9 with a drop of 18 feet. But the one we will not have any trouble remembering is Hermit Rapid. And the whole rapids on our trip, that was the most memorable rapid because it just kept going. It was 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 different waves right in another, with the people on the front of the raft, and many people have moved up for this particular ride, hanging on for dear life. And at least at one point, losing that rope that was in their hands.
I'm Joanna Horton from the UK, and I've really thoroughly enjoyed the rapid day. That was my highlight. The whole rapids, every single rapid was amazing.
And where did you spend the rapid day, Joanna?
I was on the front of the nose of the, whatever you call it.
And occasionally not on the front.
Well, yeah, that actually, maybe the highlight was letting go. I didn't realize I had let go. I didn't want to let go, but I let go on my backhand. And people said I was down in the ropes, but then I just gracefully lifted my arm up and grabbed the back. And the feeling of holding up that rope was the ultimate and was amazing.
Hi, I'm Charlie, and my favorite part of this trip has been the Hermit Rapid.
And why the Hermit Rapid?
Oh my gosh, that was an incredible ride. It was like 5 big waves, and it's just like, a nerve-wracking experience. It was just awesome.
So Joanna was riding in the middle pontoon, straddling it. When she talks about the ropes, those are the ropes that hold the pontoons together that are to the left and the right of her. Charlie is to her right. Remember, they are both what we call sucking rubber, so they have their face down on the pontoon so that the wave will wash over them. But Charlie looks down to his left and he sees Joanna, which he is not supposed to see. She has lost her grip of the backhand, but the next wave catches her and brings her back up again, and she grabs a hold of the rope behind her again, and therefore really nailed the landing.
My name is Logan Fogarty. I'm from Brandon, Florida, and I would say my biggest highlight was also the Rapids Day, and I spent just about all of my time at the front of the boat. Another notable thing that I'm probably going to be telling my kids about is whenever I got walked in on in the bathroom. That was definitely an experience. But overall, it's been a really good trip, and I think by far the biggest highlights was the Rapids Day.
My name is Alyssa. I'm from Utah. I'm here with my family, and it's been a really fun trip. It's fun to go outside and be away from your phone and work and school. And probably the highlight of my trip was yesterday when we were going down the big rapids. I was sitting in the very front and got pummeled by wave after wave, and it was super fun to be there with everyone and holding on for dear life. And yeah, that's probably the highlight.
One of the interesting things is the rapid that no one mentioned is Crystal Rapids, and that's the one we were all afraid of because that one is a 10. That is one of the 2 highest rated rapids in the canyon, but Ronnie ran it like a pro, and it really wasn't as memorable as Hermit Rapid. As I said, technical rating is different from how much you're going to enjoy it. But the trip was not over yet, even if that was the highlight day. There were many more highlights to come. We camped at about mile 108 at Hotauta. That day got to about 100 degrees, and we were camping in the gorge, which means that we were camping next to some of this black rock that was just radiating heat. Ronnie and Jeff both suggested the trick where you take that sheet that you'd been given and you go dunk it in the river, and basically you sleep under a wet sheet. And I did that until about 12:30 at night when a cool breeze finally swept up the canyon. But that's a real good trick on a hot day. If we had to label the next day, it would be waterfall day because we went to 3 different waterfalls of different sizes, as well as still doing some other rapids, including one that we went backwards unintentionally, but we were trying to get something that had fallen off the boat. And by the time we had it, that was the only shot at the rapid that Ronnie had. And it was a little bit of a surprise to all of us, but it ran just fine. And the waterfalls that day got bigger with each one that we did. So the first one was at Shinumo Creek, and this was mile 108.5. And you just hiked up less than 100 yards up the creek to find this small waterfall that included a hollow behind it so that you could go back through a very narrow, dark place and come out through the waterfall. But it was a relatively short waterfall. I don't know how tall it was, 6-10 feet or something like that, but very refreshing on a hot day. And that's what we were looking at this day. The second waterfall was a little ways up, was at 116.5, and that was Elves Chasm. And now we've got an even larger waterfall. You don't know how nice it is to have a large waterfall like this at this point because we couldn't bring soap. You can't bring soap into any of the tributaries. You can only do that in the main river. But it was still nice to rinse your hair a little bit, which has just been washed with muddy river water here for the last couple days. And by this time, we have left the upper gorge and we've gone back out into newer strata. So the uplift area we have left. And then after a while, the river turns around and comes back into that area of schist and granite in the middle gorge. And so you enter the middle gorge right around mile 127 through mile 131. So you're not in the middle gorge nearly as long as you were in the upper gorge. And you get some nice rapids in that area again because you've got that narrowing again of the canyon. So you get the Forester Rapid can be 3 to 6 and the
Fossil Rapid 5 to 6 with a 15-foot drop, and the Spectre Rapid is a 6, and the Bedrock Rapid just there as you're getting back out of the middle gorge is an 8. The Dubendorf Rapid, another 7 to 8. And right around the Dubendorf Rapid, you get to Stone Creek, and that was the third waterfall. And again, not very far to hike up to the waterfall there. And this was a spectacularly strong waterfall, especially with some of the rains that we had. As you walked close to the waterfall, it's falling, I don't know how many feet it's falling, but it's falling far enough that it's creating its own weather in there. And as you walk close to the waterfall, the wind from the falling water is pushing you away from the falls. So quite a strong waterfall there compared to anything else that we saw. And part of the group stayed down by the waterfall and just hung out while the rest of the group climbed up to a plateau above the waterfall and then also went to a slot canyon that the waterfall is coming from. That part was described as that one point you're on a very thin ledge with a sheer drop on the side. That ruled out those of us who have a fear of heights, and I am one of those people. But also, it's just very hot. And the desert hiking, I was surprised that even just sitting at a waterfall, I was going through a whole liter of water that was in my water bottle. I think everybody who went on that hike that I heard loved the hike, and everybody who didn't go on the hike loved not going on the hike. So there really is no wrong choice there. And that night we camped at Football at mile 137. And all of the recordings that I've used from the group have actually been recorded from that night. So we're at the end of the 5th day at this point. And that was an interesting place to camp because the very first part of the beach had a bit of a cave coming back into it. So a number of us slept in that cave. Of course, bats also slept in that cave and came out towards the evening, but more of a little shelf cave. But you didn't have to pitch a tent. Even if it rained, we were under the cover. And then there were 3 highlights for the last full day. And one of the highlights was geological, which is this part of the river had volcanoes north of the river back in the day. And those volcanoes relatively recently geologically, because the canyon itself was carved relatively recently to all of the different old layers that you're seeing. So no more than 25 million years ago. So 25 million years ago, the Colorado Plateau uplifts and the Colorado River starts carving this canyon, or really it's all the tributaries and all of the other things along the side, all the faults and all the earthquakes and such that carve the river, and the Colorado just takes the debris out to the ocean. But after the river was carved, these volcanoes were erupting and putting lava dams across the river. And so in this final day, in this 6th day, you're coming across basalt formations that come across the river, and all of these twisted hexagonal black crystals of rock. Again, probably the second most interesting rock in the canyon, again, I've never seen it from the rim, is here in this area. And that's right before you get to the area at the end of the day, which is Lava Falls. And Lava Falls is supposed to be the biggest rapid in North America. So that was the other one besides Crystal that we were a bit apprehensive about. But we got up early this day and had a more continental breakfast instead of the hot breakfast we've been having, because the other highlight of this day is a visit to Havasu. We were just about 19 miles from Havasu Canyon, and Havasu Canyon is one of those places where you, again, should be having blue-green waters. They weren't quite as blue-green for us because earlier in the week before we got on the river, there's some flash flooding through the Havasupai Reservation down into Havasu Canyon. And so the water was just settling out now. It was certainly clearer than the water in the Colorado at this point. But the interesting thing about this canyon is that there is a place called the Garage where they park the boats and tie them up, but it is in the middle of rapids. Not the biggest rapids we had for sure, but it's a little more challenging that you're trying to steer the boat into the side and your swamper is jumping out and trying to tie you up
while you're still in the middle of rapids. So this is one of those where they told us keep your life jackets on as you get off the boat, because we were hiking then for a while on these ledges right along the river before we turned back into the Havasu Canyon. We left our life jackets there when we turned the corner, and then did some more hiking along ledges to hike back into some of the swimming holes in the Havasu Canyon. And you could hike back for miles. In fact, you could hike out of the canyon there through the Havasupai Reservation. But it was a really wonderful place to just relax in what is now comparatively warm water. It's still not really warm. When you went into the water, there was sort of the, oh my gosh, that's cold moment. But then it was warmer than the river significantly. So I was just sitting in one of the cool pools for like an hour and a half or so. And it was not so cold that you couldn't do that. As some people were doing that and some people were jumping off rocks. The team brought snacks to eat as well. And I was chatting with Ronnie, who was telling me some of the logistics of the way things work in the canyon. So every company that takes somebody through the canyon has a certain number of people days that they are allowed to be in the canyon. Some of the companies, for instance, when people get picked up on that day we're going to get picked up, they're going to run empty with no passengers to do the rest of the run so that they don't have to use up some of their person days. If Western is doing a 7-day trip instead of a 6-day trip, they're using one more set of person days per person on the raft. And again, it's a limited quantity that they are allowed under their license. And there are no new licenses, so you just have to buy out someone's license as they decide to retire. And then a company has to pay to the park 15% of everything they make. And then if they make $1 million in that year, from then on, they have to pay 23%. So some of the companies have gotten a little tricky, and they have left some of these licenses they've bought as independent companies that are running 3 different brands under one holding company so that they don't have to get to the $1 million as quickly. After spending a couple hours really in that side canyon, we got back of the raft, took off in the middle of those rapids, and went downstream to have some lunch. I didn't mention, but for lunch, we always would just stop at one of these campsites and do something much quicker than the breakfast or the dinner. So it would typically be cold cuts or something like that. Good lunches, but less time consuming the breakfast or dinner. And then that still left us with going through those basalt fields and lava falls, which was getting closer and closer. And the one we've been thinking about all week, biggest rapid in North America. And it's a 10. And a mile before you get to Lava Falls, there's Vulcan's Anvil, a volcanic remnant tower right in the middle of the river. And so everybody knew at that point it was time to get their positions and get ready to run Lava Falls. And Lava Falls is a good run, but honestly, our best experience of the whole trip was still Hermit. And which is good, because otherwise I would have had to re-record people's highlights there after the running of Lava Falls, but still a memorable rapid. And right about this point, you start to thinking about getting off the river here. We camped at lower 185 mile, and the last 4 campsites at that particular part of the river are reserved for people who are coming out at 188 at the helicopter pad, which is what we were going to be doing the next day. The one that is right at the helicopter pad is for the first group out. We were the third group out, so we just grabbed one of the other 3. And the last night is also memorable. We've used that sheet now as a sheet. We've used it as air conditioning. We put it in the river, and now it was time for toga night. And so we had a toga party the last day. And I didn't say that some of the things they surprised us with along the way here, especially some of the desserts, we had bananas Foster with ice cream, and it was the 6th day into the trip. So they'd been keeping this on dry ice so that the ice cream hadn't melted. So a flaming dessert. We had fresh baked cakes baked in Dutch ovens. We had a birthday cake for one of the members of the party. We had German chocolate cake. That last night we had trout, not that had been caught in this river, but had been brought along and kept on ice. Remember, they still have the other group that's going to be coming the next day, and they've got their food as well. So the logistics of how you pack for this trip when you're packing a raft at the warehouse is pretty interesting because a lot of thought goes into it. One of the interesting things that I found as we're getting ready to say goodbye to people is that two of the young people who gave me their highlights the night before had this to say.
Hi, my name is Lauren, and my favorite part about this trip was, of course, getting to unplug from everything around me. Like, my favorite part is definitely got to be the fact that I get to go back to my friends and loved ones and just explain to them everything that I just did without having to explain to them while being here. So I don't get to spoil anything. I get to just go and like basically tell a whole movie. And my second favorite part is all the views, the sceneries. Like, my favorite has to be like the hike we did today. I don't remember what the name is, but it was such a beautiful scenery and the stars and everything. This is just one of the most beautiful trips I have ever been on in my life, and I will never forget it. And that's got to be my favorite.
Hi, my name is Madeline, and my highlight of the trip was probably not really being on my phone, like not being connected to what's happening in the world. It's been a little bit difficult as a 19-year-old not having that reach for always wanting to see the updates and see what my friends are saying and what's going on, but it gets a little bit easier. Like, I would used to like always lose my phone, and I think throughout this trip, like, I haven't reached to look for my phone just because like it's not on my mind at all. Obviously I'm still using it to take pictures, but I can't talk to any of my friends or anything, so I think that's just been the highlight of my trip, being able to really enjoy every moment without having a screen right in front of my hand, because I find that takes a lot of my attention and I'm not always living in the moment.
I should say I prompted no one with what their highlight was, but I told Madeline that she probably just sold 5 trips when people hear that they can get their kids disconnected if they take them down the Grand Canyon. Their parents didn't tell them to say this. I didn't tell them to say this, but I thought it was an interesting reaction. Before we go to wrap up our trip and replace us with people on this 3-day trip, which is about 48 hours really on the river, I should say that our guides said they really do prefer these longer 6 or 7-day trips because when you do a 3-day trip from Las Vegas, you're adding Grand Canyon to your Las Vegas vacation. And when you do a 6 or 7-day trip, even if you start in Las Vegas, you're adding Las Vegas to your Grand Canyon vacation. And they just get a different set of people in terms of who's on those different tours. Also, you can take younger kids. You have to be 12 to do the trip that I did, and you have to be 8 to do the 3-day trip. So they really do prefer the people they get on these longer trips. And of course, they prefer us because we were wonderful. And then that last day, we got up and needed to be at about 3 miles down the river at mile 188, where there is a helicopter pad. And I use that term loosely. There is a place where helicopters land. And so we pulled up the raft there, and we had already sorted out our bags so that we no longer had them in the dry bags and had everything packed. And they weighed us and put us in line. I actually went out with a group before us because they needed somebody to fill up a helicopter. And you helicopter out about 5 to 10 miles to Bar 10 Ranch. And Bar 10 Ranch is still in the middle of nowhere. There's still no Wi-Fi. There's still no cell phone, but there is water. And so there are showers and there are flush toilets, and we enjoyed all of those. I shaved for the first time in 6 days and took a shower so that I was all showered and fresh before the rest of the group even showed up there. And we hung out at Bar 10 Ranch and had some lunch, a last sandwich for the trip. And then basically all started taking turns flying out to either Page or to Las Vegas, depending on where we were going. Got on a small plane yet again from Grand Canyon Airline. In fact, my co-pilot was the same as we had at the beginning of the trip, and flew to Boulder City, and then again grabbed a bus up to Las Vegas. I got dropped off directly at the airport, and the rest of the group went back to the Marriott where we had started. As I go to wrap this up, This is an amazing trip. There's a reason it is a bucket list trip. I don't know if I'm going to be like Randy, who has been on the show before talking about his 10 trips down the Grand Canyon. I don't know that one might not be enough for me, but it was an amazing trip. I highly recommend it, as do everyone that I was with. Of course, they would highly recommend you go with all of us. Maybe someday we'll try and get together again and do it. It was a great group. You know my standard questions. You're standing in the prettiest spot. Where are you standing and what are you looking at? And that is really, really hard. 7 days of beautiful, beautiful scenery. But I'm going to say up there at the ancient Puebloan granaries. That was just a stunning spot. And I'm glad I made it up there, even though it took me a while to do it. One thing that makes you laugh and say only in the Grand Canyon. Oh, there are so many things that are only in the Grand Canyon. I think one thing that struck me is we're hearing all of these stories about, so-and-so who died and they named this rapid after him, or the 3 members of John Wesley Powell's party who they split up because they were so tired of being together and they hiked out and were killed, possibly by the Native Americans, possibly by the Mormons in the area. We don't really know. And yet we're doing this for vacation. It really is a relatively safe thing to do now, even though it was so not so in the past. And just as a form of recreation, even though it was so different for those people. One thing I skipped, and I don't sure what mile it was, we also stopped at a place where there were some ancient Puebloan ruins that you could see. And they were very smart. They basically took advantage of this 1 mile difference in height between the canyon and the river, and they would come down in the canyon for winter and then go up on the rim for summer, so that they always had better weather than if they'd stayed in one place or the other. And it's just interesting. It was a lot more work for them to get in and out. They did not have helicopters. And if I had to summarize the Grand Canyon in just 3 words, I would say geology, rapids, and grandeur. Beauty just doesn't sum it up nearly enough. And that was my Grand Canyon trip. Thanks again to Western River Expeditions. And I'll have links in the show notes if you wanted to do this same trip in your future. You will need to reserve more than a year in advance unless someone cancels, which is, I suspect, how I got on this trip.
This episode is brought to you by Indeed. When your computer breaks, you don't wait for it to magically start working again. You fix the problem. So why wait to hire the people your company desperately needs? Use Indeed's sponsored jobs to hire top talent fast. And even better, you only pay for results. There's no need to wait. Speed up your hiring with a $75 sponsored job credit at Indeed.com/podcast. Terms and conditions apply.
You know that feeling when someone shows up for you just when you need it most? That's what Uber is all about. Not just a ride or dinner at your door. It's how Uber helps you show up for the moments that matter. Because showing up can turn a tough day around or make a good one even better. Whatever it is, big or small, Uber is on the way. So you can be on yours. Uber, on our way.
A special thanks to the patrons of this show who help support Amateur Traveler financially. Between the patrons and the sponsors, this helps me do this as my day job now, and I appreciate that. If you're interested in learning more about how to become a patron of the show, you can go to patreon.com/amateurtraveler. There is only one new article on the website because I was on a river with no access to the internet, but that is an article about Namibia safari adventures, and that is on my list to do, and that's a guest post from one of my writers from Hotel Scoop, which is another website that I own. There are still spots open for the trip next year to Uzbekistan and Turkmenistan, and I've got an episode coming up on Turkmenistan here in a month or so that I think might talk you into it. So you might want to beat the rush and get one of those last spots. Go to amateurtraveler.com/trips. And with that, we're going to end this episode of Amateur Traveler. If you have any questions, send an email to chris2x@gmail.com, or better yet, leave a comment on this episode at amateurtraveler.com. And thanks so much for listening.
I got to see one more cathedral. I got to
sit in one more cafe. I know that I should